Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in AP English, and we turn now in our study of Dante's Inferno to Canto number 10. There are actually some scholars that want to argue this may be one of the most important cantos of all of Inferno. I'm going to call this one Dante's conversation with Farinata and Cavalcante, but truly we're going to see in this discussion of a philosophic strand of thought that I think you're going to maybe find fascinating. Now, if you haven't been following our stuff, learnstrong.net, go to the AP folder, and I'm assuming in my comments that you guys have been with me from the beginning in our guided study of the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, all the way through St. Augustine's Confessions. We've also been giving lectures, of course, on each one of the cantos 1 through 9. Let's do a real quick kind of summary of where we've been, and that way we can look backwards and then forwards. In Canto 1, we are on the 7th of April. The year is 1300. Dante the pilgrim is 35 years old, and he's lost in a dark wood. Of course, he tries to get up the mountain of God with, to make his way. The leopard, the lion, the wolf are all in the way. Virgil shows up to help him. In Canto 2, we have the invocation of the Muse. We have Virgil telling him that Beatrice is the one who sent him. And Dante finally says, all right, I'm ready, let's do this thing. In Canto 3, we have the inscription of hell, abandon hope, all ye who enter here, and all of that. We have the uncommitted souls that are, of course, not heretics because they are non-believers, not unbelievers. A non-believer is somebody who doesn't make the decision one way or the other, and you'll remember that outside of hell. They don't even get to be in hell, just like they don't even get to be in heaven. And then finally Acheron, and then we have the fainting that happens at the very end of Canto 3. Canto 4, we're in Limbo. This is circle 1, of course, of Dante's Inferno, where the unbaptized pagans will live, including Homer, Virgil himself, and obviously Aristotle, the great master philosopher. In Canto 5, we have circle 2. This one is the jacked lovers, of course. Dido, we see there again, and more particularly Francesca and Paolo, although Paolo never talks, remember. In Canto 6, we've got circle 3. This is the gluttons, and we meet Ciacco, who makes some prophecies about Florence and the final judgment. In Canto 7, we're in circle 4. This is the prodigals, those who could never hold on to a dime. They were always spending all their money, the wasters, if you will. And the avaricious, those who are always greedy and miserly. And remember, they're pushing large rocks against each other. And they have no ability to communicate. Language breaks down. We also have in Canto 7, circle 5, that's the Styx marsh, where the wrathful and the sullen, the wrathful are in the mud up above, and the sullen are down underneath, so all day out are the bubbles that come up. Again, they can't speak. Language breaks down. In Canto 8, then, we will have, of course, Philologus that will carry across the Styx, the two. There, you'll remember that Felipe will come up and try to make some comments with Dante. Dante will treat him nasty. And then finally, we are to the river, or to the city of Dis, and they're not allowed in. In Canto 9, the gates of Dis are busted open by an angel, who is a disdainful angel, you'll recall, not happy at all to be in Inferno. And then finally, they enter circle 6, which is the circle of the heretics. Now, let's get this out of the way really quickly. When Dante is talking about heresy, he's giving an idea that's actually far more amplified than simply somebody who doesn't believe in Christian theology. He's going to extend the notion of heresy to be involved with someone who knows what right belief is and refuses to believe in it, okay? That is a heretic for Dante. In other words, you could be a political heretic, and we're going to see one of those. Or you can be someone who doesn't recognize great art. We're going to see somebody like that as well here. And those kinds of people are also heretics for Dante. Now again, the key here is that you're reading this material on your own and then using me. The learning theory, we always want to go back to our foundational idea of connecting new information to old information in meaningful ways. Again, we do this in our annotative approach by talking about 3 guiding questions. Level 1, what does the text say? Level 2, what does the text mean? Here at 2A, themes, messages. At 2B, in our study, we're concentrating on symbolism and irony. We're going to see a whole lot of that going on here in Canto 10. And we're going to ask the question about Dante as poet, as politician, and as philosopher. And we're going to see a whole lot of all 3 of those, but especially the politician part. Then finally we ask the question, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? At 3a, I'm going to ask that you challenge yourself to somehow relate, beginning with the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid, all the way up through Confessions. Can you do that? And then finally, how do you relate to this stuff personally? I hope that I can ask some questions that make you at least consider this material somehow personal. All right, let's do a real quick, brief summary of Canto 10 before we read it. We have a conversation with Farinata, this very, very influential person who had died right before Dante was born. And then another interesting conversation with a cat named Cavalcante about his son, Guido, who was actually a poet contemporary of Dante. They were actually, Guido and Dante were pals, okay? And then finally, we will finish this one with a discussion about the future, not just Florence's future, but also Dante's future. All right, let's go ahead now and go to work. We'll pick up the reading now, and in many ways, I mean, you could argue that Robert Pinsky's translation is brilliant, but he just outdoes himself in Canto 10. Let's read it. And now, along the narrow pathway that ran between those tortures and the city wall, I followed my master. O matchless power, I began, who led me through evil circles at your will, speak to me with the answers that I crave about these souls and the sepulchres they fill. Might they be seen? Now, let's pause for a moment and point out that in the conclusion of Canto 9, we discovered that we were in the inside the city of Dis. By the way, for your notes, the city of Dis, many scholars will argue, is subsumed in everything that happens in the rest of Inferno. In other words, let's just say it's a really, really big city. Now, it has levels to it, but it's kind of understood by many scholars who read this as the city of Dis is a city with multiple layers, okay? And so he asks, who are these people I crave about? I want to know. I crave answers. Let's just say this is a whole lot like Glaucon in Plato's Republic, who is brave in all things. He wants to know things. He craves. The Dante the Pilgrim craves to know. Can I meet them? This will be ironic because instead of setting up a conversation, the conversation is going to come to Dante twice. We'll see. The cover of each grave is lifted open, and no one is on guard. Right? In other words, you have these coffins, these graves, these the kind of open pits, right, with fire burning under them, and people are inside, but we don't have anything like a lid. What's going on with that? And then we're told by Virgil, when they returned from Jehoshaphat above. Now, just to make sure you understand, this is referencing a biblical passage from the book of Joel, the 3rd chapter, the 2nd and the 12th verse. And it has something to do with the Kidron Valley, which is outside of Jerusalem. It has something to do with the Last Judgment. So let's put that in our notes. When they returned from Jehoshaphat above, he answered, bearing the bodies that they had, all shall be closed. In other words, in Catholic Christian theology, at the Last Judgment, bodies are returned to souls, as we said in an earlier lecture, and therefore you have this notion of perfection happening. Even perfection for those who are in hell. That is to say, they will feel even more harshly their pain. So get the drift here. Before the Last Judgment, the lids are off. After the Last Judgment, the lids go on. Which is, of course, an advantage for Dante the Pilgrim, because he's about to have a conversation, right? Okay. Then Virgil continues, here Epicurus lies with all his followers who call the soul dead when the flesh dies. In other words, this Epicurus, by the way, of course, the great philosopher who we've mentioned in earlier lectures when we were talking about Stoicism, from 341 to 270 BCE, Epicurus argued that there is no body-soul distinction in the afterlife. That is to say, when you die, you are like the dog Rover, you are dead all over. There is no soul. And because there is no soul, the best thing that can happen in life is to have a good life, to live a pleasurable life, a happy life. Now, these Epicureans are going to be qualified as heretics for obvious reasons by the Catholic Church, because the argument is there is no such thing as soul. And if there's no such thing as soul, then there's no such thing as afterlife. That's what they believed. Then they died, and now they end up here in the city of Dis, in the circle again, that has everything to do with the heretics, right? The circle number 6. So he says it this way: the question that you raise will soon be answered now that we are inside, and so will the secret wish you don't express. What is the secret wish? Well, let's go ahead and say it out loud. It's pretty clear that Dante the Pilgrim has some inside idea that maybe these dead know the future, and Dante, of course, maybe wants to know about his future. Now, notice how talking about the future has been a part of this poem right from the beginning. That is to say, Dante's told by Virgil, you're in a dark wood of error, you need help, let me take you to hell, and then purgatory, and finally paradiso. And then finally, when you get to paradise with Beatrice as your guide, you're going to be able to figure out your future. So notice, we've been playing this game from the beginning, and Virgil says, I know what you really want to know, and don't worry, I'm going to get you that intel here at some point. I said, dear guide, believe me, I do not hide my heart from you, except through my intention to speak but little the way you have said earlier I ought to be disposed. In other words, I'm going to try to stop asking so many questions. And then right in that moment, we have an interruption. This is huge. We're going to have 2 interruptions in this canto that are brilliant. The first one will be Farinata. Now, Farinata is not mentioned right yet as a name, but instead we'll just simply interrupt. While they're walking along, from out of one of the tombs rises this person, and he just begins to speak. And this is what he says: O Tuscan, who travel alive through this, the city of fire, while speaking in so courteous a fashion, if it should please you, stop a moment here. In other words, he says, will you please have a conversation with me? Notice he knows Dante is from Tuscany because of the way he speaks, his accent. Your way of speaking shows that you were born in the same noble fatherland, there where I possibly have wrought excessive harm. Now this possibly comes to mind as being significant. Why? Well, because Farinata is a bad guy. That is to say, he was a Ghibelline, and he fought against the city of Florence, and 2 different times the Ghibellines wanted to jack everybody in Florence. Now, to be fair, Farinata is an individual who did ask the city of Siena that was fighting in that famous battle at Monteperti. He did, in fact, ask that Florence not be razed to the ground. But the reason probably for that is he wanted to go in and to try and take away everybody's possessions. In other words, I don't know that it was as heroic a situation as Farinata will want to make it. He continues, he says, this sound erupted from a coffer of stone. I drew back toward my guide in alarm. So in other words, he literally kind of hides behind Virgil. It's an interesting irony, right? And then Virgil says, what are you doing? He said, go back again and see where, and then he gives the name, Farinata has set up straight. From the waist up you may behold the man. Already my eyes were on his. He sat upright, and seemed by how he bore his chest and brow to have great scorn for hell. Now, there's multiple renderings of Farinata. Some will see him as proud and disdainful towards Dante. Others will see him as proud, but at the same time willing to say to Dante, I appreciate who you are, I appreciate what you are. My leader set firm hands upon me at once. By the way, notice, it's the second time that in the last 2 cantos, Virgil has touched Dante. In the first one, remember, he covered his eyes. Here, he kind of almost like pushes him towards Farinata. You're going to have this conversation, in other words, right? And made me go forward between the rows of sepulchres, saying, choose fitting words as we wended through. In other words, be careful what you say. This is Virgil's suggestion. Be careful what you say. Why? Because Farinata is going to critique closely the language of Dante the Pilgrim. Watch what you're saying. Right? At his tomb's foot, I felt his proud gaze pierce mine for a moment, and then, as if in disdain, he spoke and asked me, who were your ancestors? Now right away, we're going to see that what Farinata will do is to become confrontational with Dante, at least confrontational through one reading of this. And he will say, I know where you're from, but who were your ancestors? That is to say, where'd you come from in terms of your lineage, your family lineage? Notice, who are your ancestors? And then, line 40, eager to comply with that, I made all plain. concealing nothing. In other words, I just told him the truth. I told him about the Alighieri family from which Dante came. By the way, the family of Farinata is a very high class family. The Alighieri family is not. So right away, in other words, we got class distinction that's going to be happening here. But he says, I told him everything, concealing nothing. Whereupon he raised his brows a little, like, oh, really? Oh, you're from that family. Then he said, these men were enemies to me. That is to say, the Florentines were enemies to me. They fiercely opposed me and my forebears and my party. So twice I scattered them. In other words, Farinata sees himself as a great warrior, a great Ghibelline warrior, and he got rid of all of the Guelphs. If ousted and abused, Dante the Pilgrim will say, I answered, they returned to claim their place from every quarter. Yours have not learned that art of return so well. In other words, he says, yeah, okay, here's the thing. You might have gotten rid of us Guelphs 2 times, but we got rid of you because we learned how to come back and return, and you obviously didn't. In other words, we've got this interesting debate that's going on between Dante the Pilgrim and his political rival, this back and forth. Now, let's pay attention in our notes here for just a second, that as we as readers follow Dante the Pilgrim through Inferno and then into Purgatorio and Paradiso finally to finish, we begin to realize that Dante in exile, the poet, begins to ask serious questions about how political kind of conflicts can be resolved. And in the end, he's going to begin to realize there is no political solution to his own exile. He can't come back because of politics. Then, we're told, right in the middle of this, when Dante has just finished, well, at least we learned how to come back, and you, your family, you Ghibellines, you never learned how to come back. Then, suddenly, we have the second interruption for your notes. The second interruption. The face of a shade appeared beside him, showing the part from the chin up. So now, unlike Farinati, that we have, from his waist up, now we only have a head that comes out of this hole in the ground from the chin up. I think, though, through having risen erect on his knees. In other words, he came up on his knees. His gaze began to dart anxiously around him, as though in expectation of someone with me. Now, notice the 2 different deportments or demeanors of these 2 shades. For Farinata, proud, disdainful, the brows and all that. For the second one, this is Cavalcante. Cavalcante will come up kind of whiny and crying, and he'll be interested right away on, who are you with? Who is with you? Because he's going to recognize right away that this is in fact Dante. We're told, but when that hope was gone, that he was looking for somebody with me, he'll be looking, by the way, for Guido, his son. When that hope was gone, he wept. And this is what Cavalcante now will say. If you can journey through this blind prison by virtue of high genius, where is my son? And why is he not with you? Notice how Cavalcante will misread entirely what's going on here. He says, so you got a trip down here into the underworld as a poet. Why can't my son have the same trip? It's as if almost Dante the Pilgrim won some kind of special award and he's been allowed as his prize to come into hell and all of that. No. He's completely misread exactly what's going on. Remember, the only reason Dante is in hell is because he's jacked up, lost in a dark wood of error. That's why he's having his trip. It's propedeutic, it's instructional. You're supposed to learn something because Dante the Pilgrim was all jacked up. That's why he had to take his trip. Notice how here Cavalcante completely misreads this, and he says, so where's my son? Why didn't my son get an award just as, in other words, we really are going to go there. He's going to argue, my son is a better poet than you are, right? He says, so my own strength, and why is he not with you? And my rejoinder, now Dante the Pilgrim will respond, my own strength has not brought me, but that of one who guides me through here, and is waiting yonder toward one your Guido perhaps has scorned. Now, this has been a subject of huge debate. He says, look, I didn't come here of my own accord. The reason I'm here is because somebody is my guide yonder. In other words, over there. Now, 2 observations. He could be talking, obviously, about Virgil. He could be talking, obviously, about Beatrice and God, right? That is to say, I'm on a mission from God. That's why I'm here. And that somebody you scorned. or somebody that your son, Guido, the great poet, scorned. Not as great a poet as maybe he thought he was because he didn't appreciate fully the other poets, especially Virgil, or maybe he didn't appreciate God. In other words, heresy, that is to say. In other words, you're an Epicurean, probably your son Guido ended up just like you, and that's why he didn't get to come on this trip with me down here. Only notice the way he said it. He says it this way: my own strength has not brought me, but that of one who guides me through here and is waiting yonder, toward one your Guido, the name of his son, perhaps had scorned. Now we have a very interesting play on syntax and grammar, especially in Italian. Notice the past tense gets used. If your son had honored Virgil more, or honored God more in the teachings of the church, either reading works. Had being past tense. Notice, I well deduced his name from his words and from his manner of punishment, and thus could answer in full. By the way, just for your notes, Guido, two things. Guido is in fact a famous poet of Florence and is a friend of Dante's. And secondly, very soon after this engagement, Guido will actually die. The assumption by Cavalcante will be, notice, as we finish, suddenly, straightening up, the shade cried out, what? Did I hear you say he had, as in he had scorn? Oh, tell, is he not still alive? Does the sweet light not strike his eyes? In other words, is my son dead? Perceiving my delay in giving my answer, he fell back flat face upward, appearing no more. Two observations. One, Cavalcante will ask, is my son dead? Dante doesn't answer him because Dante assumes that everyone in the afterlife knows what's going on up in the real world and even knows the future. So he's kind of like, you don't know about your son. Of course, the silence of not an immediate response leads Cavalcante to assume that